Welcome back to Bexhill West. Now, if you know what you're looking at, you'll see this piece of material here looks quite familiar, and we'll get into this in our next episode when hopefully we can return to some of the more glamorous side of things and start reconstructing Bexhill West. Now, those of you who've been with me for some time, regular viewers, will know that I've become a little bit frustrated with the track work. So as a recap for anybody who's new, the model is being built at 4mm scale, and I have been using 00 gauge track. Now this is a piece of Peco turnout. This is their Code 75 fine scale range, not the ballhead stuff, the sort of the flat bottom stuff. And it's fine. And if I was building a model railway to run trains, I think 00 gauge Peco track is probably perfect. Very reliable, easy to install, etc, etc. However, I'm trying to build a model that's as realistic as I can make it, and photographically I want it to be pretty spot on. Now, I recently at an exhibition purchased this rather wonderful book, and this book is full of all sorts of interesting facts and figures and diagrams and information relating to the construction of railway lines. Now, most of this is probably a little bit boring for some. However, I found it absolutely fascinating, and something that's become really clear to me from looking through this book in particular is that really, if you're building a model of a railway, that the track and the turnouts and everything else are critical to that model looking convincing. So just for example, we just have a look at this picture here. Look at the chairs. They're really rather obvious. Now, when we compare this with the Peco stuff, the little moulded pimples for the chairs, you know, there's nothing wrong with this. Like I say, if I was building something and I wanted to run trains and everything, this is fine. You know, this is good. I'm not knocking it at all. However, this is effectively the same thing. This is a turnout. This is a 4mm scale turnout in P4 gauge. And hopefully this illustrates why I've sort of taken a bit of time out to go back and revisit my track work. This for me is just so much more realistic. I'm going to put a couple of pictures up on the screen, and hopefully you can see some of the details to this. Now, I didn't make this. This was built for me by master turnout builder John James, and it's really superb. I couldn't be more delighted with it. Now, if I stick a little bogey on here, this runs beautifully. There's no wheel drop at the common crossing. It's just silky smooth. And this is what I'm hoping for. Whilst I'm not really motivated by the idea of running trains, I think that with properly built turnouts and what have you, I think the actual running of trains on P4 can be much better. So I've been practicing, and here's a length of plane track. In fact, I've done lots of plane track, and this is really very simple. You just get plastic chairs, you thread them on the rail and glue them in place. There's not a great deal to it. And so I'm looking forward to getting some of this laid. However, I can't go on forever getting John to build turnouts for me, so I thought I'd have a go at building one myself. So this is my first attempt at building a turnout. Now, it's still on the sort of the mounting paper, and you'll see what that's all about in a minute. And it works a treat. I've powered an engine through it, and it runs perfectly. So this video then is all about making a hand-built turnout. I'm not an expert. I'm merely I'm going to show you my second attempt at it, but what I'm going to try and do is whiz through it relatively quickly. I think the actual construction of this is probably something like, it probably runs for the best part of 20 minutes perhaps, but hopefully it will be of some interest. Now, I'm going to leave some of the complex detail out because it's not necessary. I just want a quick overview of how I've gone about constructing my second turnout, and here it is. This is my second go at it, and again, works a treat. And I thought we'd just make a little video about showing you what I've done and how it's been done. Like I say, I stress I'm not an expert. This is, you know, suck this and see. But hopefully, anybody who's thinking about building a turnout, they hopefully will show that the process needn't be that daunting. Now you might be thinking, well, I'm not getting into P4, that's all a lot of hassle, and yes, I think it is. However, the same process could be, any gauge, O gauge, double O, N gauge, whatever. With the same processes, you could build your own track work for any gauge, and of course that enables you to make custom built sort of point work and what have you. So anyway, let's get into the video and see how it goes. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm just putting together the template which I printed off from Templot, and Templot has tessellated this over a couple of sheets, so I'm just using a bit of double-sided tape here just to join these two sheets together, and I'll quickly just check the alignment with the steel rule, that's fine, and I'll chop these out. Now I'm speeding this sequence up because otherwise it'd be very, very long and potentially quite tedious, so we'll try and reduce the tedium by speeding the footage up. So with the template prepared, I just mount it onto a piece of old laminate flooring with some masking tape. Nothing too complicated here, very straightforward. Now for this next step, I've got a piece of, I think this is a piece of baking paper. Now I should be using a piece of tracing paper here, and I just couldn't find any, which is silly really, because I used to spend lots of time drawing with it. The funny thing is, actually, when I finished recording all of this, I then found a whole pack of it. But anyway, I'm using the baking paper so that I can see through to the template below. Probably unnecessary, but you'll see at the end we can salvage the template. So what I'm doing is just ruling in some of the key sort of fixed points on the template, the rail lengths and etc. Now what I'm doing here is I've used a steel rule just to set up the straight edge for the sleepers. Now Templot does a wonderful thing, it gives you a list of all the sleepers you need, the lengths and the numbers of them. So I'm just quickly whizzing along, and what you maybe just be able to see is I've put some lengths of double-sided tape on top of the baking paper, and these are just sort of sticking to those, so I'm just popping those in, and I can see, looking at this back, one or two of them are a bit wobbly, but I'm sure there's a prototype for that. So this is quite quick and simple. That steel rule really helps just to keep everything nice and square, and you'll see that the sleepers are the sort of prototypical lengths in that they look a bit awkward along the top edge there, but when the curved stock rail goes in, I think that'll all look fine. Okay, so next thing I'm doing here is just writing down what type of chairs will be fitted to the sleepers. And here you can see I'm just marking out some bends for the check rails. And I'm just going to tweak the ends of these with a pair of pliers just to put the bends onto the check rails. We'll come back to these in a little while. In fact, no, we won't. We'll come back to the check rails now. So what I've done is I'm sliding on some of the check rail chairs onto a piece of rail. Now this is quite a fiddly job, and it's a good job I've sped this up, otherwise we'd be here all day. And so having pushed those onto the rail, you can see I've got them there, all in the correct order. Now what I do is I take one of the check rails, and which I've bent one end at this stage, and I feed that through. It's a little bit awkward, but it does go. And then I'll take the whole lot. Can you see the bent end there? So I've got one bent end. So if I slide the whole lot now up to the other end of the rail, I can expose the other end that needs bending. Now I couldn't think of a better way of doing this, and I couldn't find any advice that I understood online. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to put a little bend on the end of that, the second end of that check rail, and you'll see it sort of will encapsulate those chairs. Now that bend I didn't get it quite right, so I'll have another go at it. And you'll see in a moment hopefully why I've done it in that peculiar way. So when I spread these check chairs out along the check rail, there we go, you see it would be impossible to slide those on if I sort of pre-made the bends on both ends. And so there we go, that's the first straight stock rail, and you can see I've put all the correct chairs on. You can see 2 small L1 chairs there as well. There we go, and they drop on. I've not put the slide chairs on at this point, we'll come back to those later. Now what I'm doing here is I'm getting my straight edge lined up, and I'm going to put a couple of bits of tape on here so that this will form a sort of a hinge, and you'll see why in just a moment. So having lined that up, I now have a straight edge against which I can push that piece of rail. The rail, when it was supplied to me, had a slight bend in it. So this is just a way I can use to ensure that that rail is nice and straight. And what I'm going to do now is use a little bit of solvent here, some butanone, and I'm just sort of flooding that under the chairs at one end of this rail, and so that they weld to the sleeper. Now I'm trying to be cautious here. I want to put enough on that it sort of makes a good joint, but not too much that I sort of overdo it. And I'm using the steel rule is actually resting against the chair, and a little bit of pressure on there for a minute or so just to make sure that that's properly bonded. Okay, so I've come to the other end of the rail now, and I'm just using my scalpel blade to line up those chairs, try and get them nice and central on the sleepers. It's very easy to sort of get these slightly off. But there we go, something like that. Just adjust this one a little bit more. Now this is where I wish my eyesight were a little bit better, but anyway, there we go, we've got those two pretty much lined up, and just as before, a little bit of butanone. We'll sort of weld those plastic surfaces together, and then again a bit of pressure just to hold it together. Now then, with my steel rule taped as I've done it there, the tape forms quite a handy little hinge, and you'll see in a minute I'll be able to fold it back and kind of see how I've got on. But before that, I'm just applying a bit more butanone to sort of the intermediate chairs, having first checked that they're lined up. And I think I come back to one of these in a moment whilst before the solvent is fully cured, and just adjust them. There we go, using the edge of my scalpel. I probably ought to use something a bit more appropriate, but I'm using the back of the blade. And there you go, you can see that sort of hinge action there, so I can have a look, check that everything's okay, and I can start to, now that they're all fixed and they're kind of glued, if you like, along one side, I can now come back with a little bit more butanone and on the other side. And I find that the arrangement I've got here of the steel rule, it's actually pressing not on the rail but just on the top of the chairs. It's kind of oversailing the ends of the sleepers, just pressing on the tops of the chairs, and it works quite well. So here's the previously assembled sort of crossing V. I'm going to drop that on. You sort of see how that's going to go, and I'm going to use this little gauge here. Just to line it up. Now I come in with the ruler here against that line that I'd sort of traced through from below, and that's just making sure I get the nose of the V sort of bang on where it needs to be. And then when I'm happy with that, of course I can cement those rail chairs in place. Of course, going back first with the sort of the blunt side of my scalpel and just tweaking those chairs, making sure they're in the right place. I'm sure I'll do a close-up later, a photograph, and we'll see that some of them are wrong, but this is already small stuff. Anyway, a little bit more fiddling about, measured twice, cut once, etc. I think it was about at this point I was sort of finally happy with where I'd got that. You can see a little bit of brass that I've added underneath the V there, just to sort of lift it up, so it's supported at the same height that these Cosmatic Exacta scale chairs hold the rest of the rail. And so I'm obviously happy with the position of that, so just using a bit of butanone again just to cement these into place. This is really difficult to do when you've got a camera in the way, but there you go. Now I think at this point this is the hard work done. This sort of sets up the rest of the turnout construction, and certainly my previous attempt, once I reached this point, it all seemed sort of plain sailing from here on in. And there you go, that's where we've got to so far. So the next step then was to fit the curved stock rail, and that was basically the same as the straight rail. I put all the chairs on, exactly the same chairs as the straight rail, and that was fitted in place using various gauges just to sort of control the gauge at the V end and at the switch end. And that was quite straightforward. Now my camera battery died, so I didn't get the actual gluing up of that, but this is sort of how the setup went, and it was quite straightforward. I sort of pre-bent the curve a little bit. Now something that's really important to mention is at the switch end on the far right hand side of the screen, I've marked a line with the set bend, and there is a bend in the stock rail at that end, very slight bend, and I'll maybe look at that in another video. Okay, and you can just see I've just sort of balancing there the wing rails in place. Now to keep this video, you know, not too long and too boring, I'll look at how they were made another day, but essentially they're just bits of rail that were cut to length and bent as per the plan. And this is kind of the setup, again with the little gauges just sort of holding it in place. And the chairs were cemented just as before. So you can see the P-type chairs still need to be fitted there. And here we go. Now the ends of those, the left-hand ends of those wing rails will be soldered to that little brass strip which is under the crossing V. But that's not been done at this point. I'm just adding some more of the chairs. Now again, I won't go into the detail here because this is sort of trying to keep this brief, but there are drawings available that show you what types of chairs go in what locations, and it's quite interesting to delve into it and find out a little bit about it. Now I was lucky I picked up a book recently which had all of this information in, and I've been reading that from cover to cover several times actually, trying to get my head around all the terminology, and I keep getting mixed up, so I won't get into that now, but just want to show you how sort of straightforward this process is. It's like assembling an Airfix kit really. So that's all sort of fairly straightforward at this point. And at this point it was quite interesting because I've now got two bits of line that I can actually test. And so you may recognise this. This is one of the bogies off of the Mansell carriages that I've been working on. Well, they've all now been re-wheeled to P4, so there's a set of P4 wheels in here. And this was quite remarkable how smooth this passed across the V crossing. I expected there to be a little sort of a bump in it, and there really isn't. It is beautifully smooth. I wish I'd sort of captured the video of this bit a little bit more clearly, but the wheels don't drop. You would imagine that they would drop into that sort of opening created by the common crossing there, but no, that's not the case. The check rails on the side obviously doing their jobs. Okay, so what I'm doing now is preparing the switch blades, and the two lines that you can sort of see I'm working to there that were sort of traced through from the template plan, that shows the length of the planing, which is the angle that the end of the blades needs to be filed to. And you can see I'm just lining them up here. I've had an idea. You can get jigs for doing this. I haven't got one, and I'm sort of got some ideas for how I might make one. This just shows you how I did it. It's just a piece of wood, and I've filed this about halfway through the job, just filed a gentle taper on the end. And then with the correct chairs on, these were S1 chairs with a couple of the smaller little bridge chairs. I think they're called L1s on the far right hand side of that that switch. In fact, actually in the middle of the switch, the far right hand side is obviously the bit that slides. So that was set up with the gauges, and the straight blade has gone in. And again, I'm having some fun testing this thing. You can see I've added the P chairs, which are the slide chairs that the blades sort of slide across as the turnout is switched. I haven't fitted the tie bar in yet, and I'm still in two minds as to quite how I'm going to go about that, so I won't be fitting those just yet. But I was really impressed with this. The first one worked quite well, but this one's even better. So there you go, quite pleasing little job, quite therapeutic as well, putting it all together. So finally then, let's give it a little test. Now I must apologise, I'm using a very cheap train set controller from my youth here, and it's not allowing this engine to run as slowly as it can, so it's a bit jittery, but you can see it's passing over there quite nicely. Please excuse the crude yellow wire at the end. That's just sort of setting up the polarity and the continuity to the frog, and I have to swap that round when I try different roads out. But this worked a treat. This engine, by the way, is lovely. Oops, there we go. Probably should edit that out. Little mishap there, but yeah, this engine really runs a treat. So I must get a better controller so we can run it at a scale speed. So there you have it. That was my sort of attempt, or my second attempt at creating a turnout. The first works just the same. I think this one has been built a little bit more finely, and I'm sure that I will only improve as I practice a little bit more. But there you go, quite a simple process. Of course, this is in P4, but this could be 00 gauge, or any gauge you like. The process would still be pretty much identical. Anyway, I'm very pleased with how it's running. I think it's when I properly get the hang of this and I start producing them with even greater finesse, I think it'll be very pleasing to watch the stock running over here really smoothly. So that's my second attempt. These things are not expensive to make. The parts are, are not expensive at all. Certainly a lot cheaper than if one was to buy a commercial, like a Pico Point, for example. Now the tricky bit is probably making the V crossing, and they can be bought in. They're quite expensive to buy and not difficult to make. So perhaps in a future video, I'll show you sort of how I went about making that and add a bit more detail to this video. So I say this video is just really a quick glimpse at what I've been up to. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Next week we're going to get into the baseboards, and we should see some real progress with the track actually going down, and hopefully we can rebuild Bexhill West and get it back to where it was. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Cheerio.